So you can't see this, but hopefully you can hear it. Behind every Boise State Public Radio podcast is a team working hard to bring you stories that matter. So if you value podcasts like this one, please support them. Hit donate at boisestatepublicradio.org. Thanks.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it is our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. A lot to get to today. And our panel includes Dawn Day, the founder and editor of BoiseDev.com, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports, Troy Oppie, All Things Considered host right here with Boise State Public Radio, Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for Valley Lookout, and Ian Mack Stevenson with the Idaho Statesman. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Hi, Gemma.
So let's begin at the State House today. And Ruth, let's talk Medicaid expansion. Before we get into what's going on right now, can you just give us a brief history of the process it took to get Medicaid expansion in Idaho?
Sure. So voters passed Medicaid expansion in 2018 through a citizens initiative, and they received more than 61% of the votes in favor, which is pretty overwhelming. Over the years, there have been multiple attempts to change it or to limit it, always met with overwhelming opposition. But this year, we've seen some pretty remarkable bills to either change expansion, repeal it altogether. We've seen efforts to change the citizens initiative process to make it harder to get something on the ballot. I think as of December 2024, there are currently somewhere between 85,000 and 90,000 people enrolled currently in Medicaid expansion. And prior to expansion, there was this population of people who essentially, they made too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough money to afford private insurance. And so those were the gap population that expansion has remedied.
Okay, so Ruth, tell us, you mentioned there have been all kinds of efforts, not just this session, but over the years to repeal Medicaid expansion. So what's going on with this current bill? And what would it do if passed?
Sure. So this is House Bill 138. It's from Representative Jordan Redmond, who, if folks want to watch Idaho Reports at 8 p.m., Jordan Redmond, as well as Representative Egbert, are going to be talking about this very thing. So 8 p.m. on public television. But Representative Redmond's bill would add 11 waivers. Now, keep in mind, to get a waiver for a Medicaid expansion plan, it needs to be approved by the federal government. So his waivers, some of them include those that are, quote, able-bodied adults would be required to work or volunteer. It would put a cap on the number of, quote, able-bodied adults on expansion. It would, there's also a 3-year time limit on how long those folks would be allowed to continue to stay on expansion. And it does not include folks that are seniors or disabled, but Redmond's bill does put a cap at 50,000 people, which is concerning to many people.
Because we're at 90,000 right now, so there's like a 40,000 person deficit there.
Correct, and I think there are many people that would not be able to comply with these 11 waivers. I also think that it is highly unlikely that the federal government would grant all 11 waivers. And so the bill is very clear that if all 11 waivers are not in effect by July of 2026, the bill would repeal Medicaid expansion in its entirety. And so all of those people, even those that might be seniors or disabled, would be without health care. I think further complicating it, the state did take away what was called the Catastrophic Healthcare Fund and County Indigent Funds, which were previously, before expansion, they were relied on to assist individuals in catastrophic situations who had healthcare financial needs. And so should Redmond's bill pass and we don't get those 11 waivers from the federal government, there's no backup plan, because the CAT fund and the indigent fund were the backup plan in the past.
So Ruth, where is the bill right now? What happens next?
Sure. So after upwards of 2 hours of testimony, it did pass out of the House Health and Welfare committee by just one vote, and now it will head to the House floor. So we'll see what the House of Representatives has to say.
Okay, appreciate that update. And Ian, Ruth mentioned many attempts over the years to limit voter initiatives, and Medicaid expansion is just one example of that. So this has happened many times during the legislative session, during numerous legislative sessions. What is going on this year in regards to a latest bill to advance this agenda of either limiting voter initiatives or frankly, making them nearly impossible to get on the ballot?
Yeah, so there's a proposal in the legislature at the moment to amend the state's constitution to increase the signature requirement for voter initiatives. So currently, before citizens can bring an initiative before voters on the ballot, they have to get a certain number of signatures from voters around the state. At the moment, the requirement is that of the state's 35 legislative districts, you have to get 6% of the voters essentially in 18 of those districts, so roughly half of them. This constitutional amendment would up that threshold to all 35 districts. So you have to get 6% of the registered voters to sign your petition in all of the state's legislative districts. This is something listeners who've been listening to the news in Idaho for a number of years might remember from 2021. That was a year that the state legislature passed a law to do the same thing. And it was struck down by the Idaho Supreme Court, which said that it would essentially limit in an unconstitutional way the fundamental rights that citizens have to bring ballot initiatives onto before their peers, before voters. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court actually said in their opinion that if the legislature's goal had been to prevent any initiative or referendum from qualifying for the ballot in the future, then, quote, this is probably an effective tactic, end quote. So that was declared unconstitutional. So now lawmakers are bringing a constitutional amendment that would do the same thing. So unlike a bill, this would require 2/3 majorities in both of the legislature's chambers, and then it would also itself go to voters for approval. And yeah, so I think, and I think some important context here is that, as Ruth was discussing, there have been some prominent ballot measures in past and recent years. The ballot initiative process has been around for over 100 years in the state, and I think there have been about 15 successful initiatives in that period. But recent years have seen prominent ones like Medicaid expansion, but also other efforts to raise education funding, or most recently last year, there was an effort to bring about open primaries in the state, mm-hmm. And the Republican Party's closed primary. And the current leadership of the Republican Party in the state was very opposed to that proposal that went before voters in November and failed by a large margin. But it was a concerted effort of the leadership of the party to oppose the initiative last year. And I think now you're seeing Republican members of the legislature kind of pushing that same effort to limit the initiatives by, making it more difficult to bring initiatives onto the ballot. And so we'll see how this proposal proceeds.
Ian, what I find so interesting about this is that it is already difficult to get a voter initiative on the ballot here in the state of Idaho. Not just to get it on the ballot, but then for it to even pass, you have to have, it's more than a 60% majority. And there is no way in the state of Idaho that you cannot get this passed with just Democrats voting yes for something, or frankly, even just Republicans voting yes for something. There actually has to be like bipartisan support on voters to pass an initiative. So I just want people to understand that if they don't necessarily understand how a voter initiative works in the state, because, here there's a push to make this even more difficult, yet it really is the voice of the voters who come to the polls and say yes or no.
Yeah, and I can mention, this isn't the only proposal related to initiatives this year. There are a number of efforts to change the process. One of them actually failed recently in committee. But that would have allowed the governor to, let's say, an initiative gets all the signatures it needs and then gets majority approval from voters. It would have allowed the governor to then veto an initiative. That bill will not be moving forward, but there is a third proposal to change the threshold requirement that initiatives have to get from a simple majority to 60%. So that these are all kind of efforts to require larger portions of voters to get an initiative approved and get it made into law. Because once a ballot initiative passes, it has the same force of law that any of the other legislation that lawmakers pass at the Idaho legislature do.
Appreciate that update. So, Troy, Ada County is beginning the process of setting its budget, and I know you've been following this closely. So, tell us about what during one of these meetings, one of the county commissioners said budget setters should take inspiration from Doge.
Yeah, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency that's being run by Elon Musk and other folks through the federal government right now, that is charged with running through budgets to root out waste and irresponsible spending, they say. Commissioner Ryan Davidson here in Ada County, as the initial budget hearing was getting underway, and I guess it's probably not fair to call it a hearing. It was commissioners and Clerk Trent Triple talking in a meeting with county budget heads, kind of introducing them to how they're going to go through the budgeting process this year. Commissioner Davidson said, this should be a good inspiration, because we don't want to be having wasteful spending in these types of things. And he doesn't expect that they would find it in Ada County, because department heads keep a close eye on that. But Davidson called it a good omen that the country is going through this. And I think it should be noted that a lot of these federal budgets that Doge is going through to make cuts were public before. They weren't hidden necessarily. And just like Ada County and the state of Idaho does, the federal government publishes these budgets and its spending for most agencies already.
All right. Appreciate that, Troy. Don, Eckert Bridge in East Boise was closed very quickly a few weeks ago when they found massive infrastructure issues. And so we know the bridge has to be replaced. Talk to us about how ACHD has actually secured funding really quickly to get this process moving forward.
Yeah, the Ada County Highway District is often a hot topic in the legislature, as you know, and very publicly thanked Governor Little and the state for helping it to secure funding for some of the bridge costs through the Local Highway Technical Assistance Council. Our Sydney Kidd reported on this earlier this week. Really, the idea is this will give them a boost in getting that bridge replaced. As we back up a little bit, a couple weeks ago, this bridge that links the Boise River, or links across the Boise River from the Barber Valley area to southeast Boise, was closed rather abruptly after inspectors found what they termed as some potentially alarming issues with the bridge. They said, hey, you can keep this bridge open as long as you don't have any more than 3 tons on it at any one time. 3 tons is about the weight of an average minivan. And so they closed the bridge down, and that cuts off one of just a few access points into the Barber Valley. This is key for a lot of people who don't maybe live out there, because floating the river means you need to get into Barber Park, which is on one side of that bridge, right at the bridge. So ACHD went kind of looking for funding. They had initially said that they might have to move around or delay some projects. We saw this a few years ago with the Cloverdale Bridge, which had been hit more than once by traffic on I-84, but finally got hit so bad that they had to shut it down, and the Highway District had to move some projects around there. Similar process they were worried was in place here. Now, Sydney asked ACHD, well, is this all the funding? And they said, well, we don't know, because we don't know how much the project is going to cost. And so they're still trying to figure that out. They're also there's another bridge at play here, which is safe, but is something that they wanted to redo, and that is the bridge over the canal that's right there. If you've driven through there, it's kind of a weird, like, you swerve around, and there's a bridge over the New York Canal, a bridge over the Reidenbach Canal, and then the bridge over the river, and then there's the entrance to Barber Park, and then you swerve the other way. Like, it's kind of a weird configuration. So they had already been at work on this, as Sydney had actually reported earlier this spring, to kind of iron this out. Now they're trying to move that along more quickly. Um, it was interesting. I sat in a Boise City Council meeting where ACHD's executive director Ryan Head spoke, and the city council was asking some questions. The bridge is actually open for pedestrian traffic, so if you want to walk over the bridge, you can. And the ACHD director had this funny comment, like, "It might be okay to walk across, but I don't think I would sit there and have a picnic or anything."
Okay.
That was enough for me to go, maybe I won't walk across either. So they're definitely concerned about this. Still no timeline on when this is going to happen. We're headed towards that float season, and there hasn't been an indication of some sort of remedial plans, but I think it's safe to say there's going to have to be some adjustments in that traffic flow for people hoping to head down the river or just enjoy Barber Park this summer.
Mhm. Yeah. So, Dawn, even though they have the funding, I mean, is there a timeline now?
No, yeah, that's what I was just saying. They don't know.
Yeah.
They're working
Okay.
on it. I'm sure they want to get a timeline out as quickly as they can, because I imagine they're feeling the heat.
So, Drew, more than 2,000 acres of state endowment land, which is around Payette Lake, might actually become part of a Payette National Forest soon. This is all due to a land exchange. But before you get into all of that, can you take us back, give us some history? Because this goes back, what, about 5 or so years?
Yeah, I'm glad you started there, Gemma, because you're absolutely right. To understand the significance of where we are today with this land exchange, you have to go back really at least 5 or 6 years. I mean, you could go back to statehood, but we don't have all day. And so let's just go to 2018. There was the Idaho Department of Lands issued a lease for about 30 acres of lakefront endowment land on East Side Drive. And this lease was for a wedding and event center. It was called Lookout on the Lake. It was a very primitive, no permanent structures. It was paver patios, tents, that kind of thing. They leased this site, and the neighbors did not find out about it until after the lease had already been executed. And the lease rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of like $4,000 a year for this site, and the neighbors challenged it. They had all kinds of issues with it: noise, traffic, pollution, you name it. But their argument really centered on this idea that because nobody knew that this lease application had been submitted, that IDL had failed to satisfy its constitutional mandate to maximize long-term financial returns from the use of endowment lands. And so this ended up going to the state land board, and the land board agreed with the neighbors and said, yes, IDL did not do enough to maximize profits from the use of this land, and so the lease was rescinded, and the state wound up settling with that lessee. But the argument used by the neighbors, and specifically it was the Tamarack Bay condominiums, the argument they used, this constitutional mandate argument, it was noticed because a year later, that all got resolved in 2019. A year later, in 2020, a proposal comes forward to IDL to trade 21,000 acres of endowment land around Payette Lake for 21,000 acres of timberlands in northern Idaho. This was submitted by Trident Holdings. This was a Boise investment real estate firm, and the argument presented by Trident's founder Alec Williams was that the state was not satisfying its constitutional mandate to hold on to these Payette Lake endowment lands, which the state had admitted were underperforming as timberlands. That's typically how the state likes to manage its endowment lands for timber. They'll also do leases for recreation, for grazing, mineral leases, things of that nature. But primarily, they manage for timber, and these lands around Payette Lake are not great timberlands. And so the uh, the state had this proposal, and Trident was saying, look, you have no better alternative on the table, and kind of applying pressure to the state in that way. Once again, it went to the state land board, and the land board ultimately turned down Trident's proposal. They found that Trident had undervalued the Payette Lake endowment lands by somewhere in the magnitude of $292 million because Trident was valuing them as timberlands as opposed to highest and best use, which of course is development for better or for worse. But since then, that got resolved in 2021. Since then, the state has kind of been trying to get out of the business of Payette Lake endowment lands because for the simple reality that the highest and best use of these lands financially is development. They adopted a management plan around the time of the whole Trident proposal, and that plan covered a little over 5,000 acres of the endowment lands closest to Payette Lake. And it basically created a disposition schedule for lease or for sale of these endowment land parcels at prescribed values, within 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, or 20 plus years for what that looked like. And it was based on access to utilities, things of that nature. But since then, that was kind of the time at which it was realized that okay, maybe the Idaho Department of Lands isn't the best agency to steward these public lands. Um, and so that was the first time that this idea of land exchange for the Payette Lake endowment lands between the Forest Service and IDL was brought up.
Okay, so Drew, with all that said, what's happening now in regards to that land? Because so as you mentioned, this is now a negotiation, between the Forest Service and the Idaho Department of Lands?
That's correct. Yeah. So for about the last year, they've really started hammering out the details of what this exchange might look like. And as presently proposed, it's about 21,000 acres that the state would receive of what is currently national forest land here in Valley County and over in Adams County, in return for about 5,500 acres of what is currently state endowment land. Now, those 5,500 acres, only about 2,200 of that is actually around Payette Lake. The other parcels are within the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and some other isolated backcountry parcels in Eastern Valley County. So that's kind of the basis of the exchange right now. Primarily, the 21,000 acres the state would get are over in Adams County along the US 95 corridor, kind of near Lost Valley Reservoir. Um, but it also includes about 3,500 acres that are bordering Tamarack Resort to the north and the south. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these lands around Tamarack, the resort has already proposed expansion plans for. And so the intent is, and Tamarack has been involved in these negotiations, the intent is that the state would take control of these lands from the Forest Service, and then on day one, have a steady funding source by way of Tamarack, who would turn around and lease those lands from the state for the resort. And to be clear, the state and Tamarack already have a relationship. The ground that Tamarack operates on today, the resort currently contains, is leased from the Idaho Department of Lands. So these agencies, they're comfortable with each other. They know each other. This is not a novel concept for them.
So, Drew, what's the likelihood that this land exchange will actually happen, and when?
Well, look, that's anybody's guess. Negotiations can always fall apart in any walks of life, whether it's between public agencies or otherwise. What I can tell you is that once the agencies, the Forest Service and the Idaho Department of Lands agree on terms, they'll take it to the state land board. The state land board will have to sign off on it. And then at that point, it would go to Washington, D.C. It would take a federal legislative action to actually approve the exchange since it involves federal lands. I don't have a timeline for when that would happen. I would anticipate sooner. There's been an indication on IDL's part that they would like to make this happen sooner than later. I can certainly tell you there's motivation from both agencies to make this happen. But when exactly that will be, gosh, that's anybody's guess.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that. So, Ian, let's head back to the State House because there is a bill right now that would require the Bible to be read every single day in public schools. And my understanding is the lawmaker who brought this bill says he wants to, quote, cultivate morality. So can we just start with the bill itself and what it would do? Because there are a lot of feelings about this bill on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. So this bill would require a number of verses from the Bible to be read without comment in every occupied classroom at a public school in the state every day. And the intent of the sort of schedule of verse reading is that it would result in the entire Bible being read in each classroom over a 10-year period. And it does include a couple of exemptions. So if a teacher has an objection to reading the Bible, they wouldn't be required to, but some other adult would be required to take their place and read it before the classroom. And then there's also an exception for students who don't want to have the Bible read to them, except it requires a note from their parents. So the student on their own couldn't object. Their parents would have to endorse that as well. And yeah, I think that's basically the kind of outline of the bill.
All right. So my question then, Ian, is that the U.S. Supreme Court barred school-sponsored prayer and Bible reading in public schools, I mean, all the way back in 1963. So wouldn't a bill like this, if it went into law, be unconstitutional? So how would they get around that?
Yes, good question. So I think, the important context here is that this is an effort that we're seeing, around the country, not just in Idaho, by Christian conservatives to kind of bring down some of the firewalls between religion and the state that have been in place for decades, for 60 years or longer, as you mentioned, based on some Supreme Court decisions from the mid 20th century that really laid out pretty strong separations between church and state. And that's kind of the regime that we've been living under in the decades since. And so this is a really kind of direct attack, I think you could say, on some of those Supreme Court precedents, challenging those decisions and hoping that the current Supreme Court, which has a majority of justices appointed by Republican presidents in recent years, might take a different view of the Constitution and might allow more a larger and more prominent space for religion in public life. And we've already seen that in some cases. There was a Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago, for instance, that allowed a football coach at a public school to pray on the field with his players before games. So we're already seeing, I think, from the current Supreme Court, kind of more of an appetite or more of a interest in allowing religion in public spaces. So this is kind of, I guess, another step in that effort that some of these activists are pushing for from the Christian right. And so, yeah, this would, as you mentioned, there is a Supreme Court decision from 1963 that explicitly bars mandated Bible reading in public schools, based on the idea that it violates the Establishment Clause of the Constitution and endorses a religion. This would very likely, if it were to become law, this bill would be challenged based on that precedent, and it would be up to courts to decide whether they want to review that precedent or not. I'll just mention there's also another bill that was introduced this morning to require the Ten Commandments to be displayed in all public schools. This is something, again, I think part of the same effort from the Christian right. Louisiana actually has a similar law, and a federal judge last year preliminarily said it violates the Constitution on its face. I think based on, like we've been discussing, a lot of these prior rulings from the mid-century U.S. Supreme Court that are now potentially coming under review, or that some activists are hoping will be reconsidered, and will allow for more religion in public life, at least, that they would like.
Well, and we should note that, I mean, all this push, not just in Idaho, but as you mentioned, in other states like Oklahoma and Louisiana, are pushing a Christian religion. So I'm curious, Ian, if there's been any talk, and you may not have the answer to this, if something like this were to pass, I mean, not only would it be unconstitutional, but then, okay, what about other religions being able to read their holy books in schools, to be able to display, their messages of faith? I mean, it's a slippery slope, it seems.
That's a good question, and actually, that's something that came up in the introduction hearing for the Bible bill. There's been, in recent years, the U.S. Supreme Court has started, when they kind of analyze legislation, they've often done it through the lens of what they call history and tradition, whether something has a historical precedent in the country. And so there's a lot of focus in this Bible school reading bill on the founding of Idaho as a state in the late 19th century, and how in past years up through the early 20th century, there was Bible reading in the school that was pretty widely accepted, and that some of Idaho's founding fathers endorsed. And so I think there's a hope there that because there's a Christian tradition in the state, that will allow for this to be kept in place. But the sponsors were explicitly saying that it would not allow for religious texts from other religions, the Quran, for instance, or Hindu texts or any other religion, to be read, because there isn't that same historical precedent. So it's definitely a push to have Christianity kind of preeminent in the of the various religions that, of course, there are around the country and around the state.
Okay, Don, there is a piece of land that Boise Planning and Zoning approved. They approved for townhouses to be built. And then, like an hour later, the Boise School District decides to buy the land, but nobody knew this was happening. So can we just start with, okay, let's go back to this planning and zoning meeting, because a lot of folks objected to this townhouse project.
Yeah, and that's not fully atypical for neighbors to be upset about potential development in their neighborhood. This is a strange one. This all rolled out Monday night, and I've been covering development around here for a few days, and this is strange. So the Planning and Zoning Commission had this in front of them. It had been delayed a couple of times, and they heard from neighbors who were upset about 31 potential townhomes that would be built right across from White Pine Elementary and next to the Timberline High School track in Southeast Boise. So if you're familiar with that area, kind of Boise Avenue, Apple, and Linden Streets. And so this developer had basically cobbled together 3 lots that would face White Pine, and they'd put 31 townhomes and a retail space on it. Neighbors were upset about a number of factors. Some of them, were the typical things like parking and density, and the way that the townhomes would be taller than surrounding buildings, affordability. There was quite a bit of talk about environmental concerns. There was a story in another news outlet that was bringing together, I don't know how to even say this without sounding problematic, but saying that tearing down buildings with potential asbestos is going to make us all sick. The story wasn't really necessarily based on scientific fact, but neighbors used that to say, hey, we're going to tear down this building. It might have asbestos. Like, what are you doing? And a lot of animated stuff from that. Somebody yelled out during the hearing that the commissioners had blood on their hands. It was kind of a strange hearing. Ultimately, the Planning and Zoning Commission said, hey, we appreciate all of those concerns, but we have to focus on the code. And the code basically says, as we interpret it, that this can be approved. So that happened at about 9 o'clock, after about 3 hours of the hearing. And then about 10 minutes later, across town on Victory Road, the Boise School District went into a rather lengthy executive session, and they talked about some personnel stuff. And they came out of the executive session and they moved, hey, let's buy this property next to the Timberline High School track for $3.4 million. And it allows us to expand the Timberline campus a little bit. We don't have a plan for it right now, but we think this will make neighbors happy. And it was kind of peculiar because they didn't reference that this project had just been approved. A planning and zoning commissioner was actually kind of aggrieved with the school district because the school district didn't submit public comment in this process, even though it would put about 250 vehicle trips onto Linden, which is like right across from the White Pine
Right across
driveway.
from the
It's a really congested area, and roads are congested. Our city's growing, but there's a lot of congestion there. And the school district didn't weigh in, and the planning and zoning commission was like basically kind of a vote the bums out type of message, like was pretty stern. And then the school district sweeps and buys it. And so we had gotten a tip that the school district was going to buy this land. I was like, that doesn't seem right. And I had just checked the agenda. There was nothing on there, but the executive session cited a provision in Idaho code that allowed them to talk about a potential real estate acquisition. I was like, oh, maybe this is the same thing. I doubt it. Who knows? And so I watched the stream online, and sure enough, the school district buys it. So I had asked the school district previous to the meeting, like, hey, I heard this rumor. Is it true? They didn't answer. I watched the meeting, and I sent them a whole bunch more questions. And essentially what had happened is during the process to build this, the school district had apparently behind closed doors expressed some concerns to the developers, and the developers went, well, why don't you just buy it from us? And the school district went, all right, and apparently had $3.4 million in a facilities fund that would allow them to do that. And so the 3-hour hearing and the neighbors who went down to City Hall and all of those things was for naught. It just didn't matter. The school district is going to, as long as the deal goes through, is going to buy the property and the project will be off. What's interesting here is that it seems like they needed to get the approval for the townhomes to make the appraised value of the property line up. The school district said they have an appraisal, and we haven't gotten that appraisal yet. We're trying to get that. But often properties are appraised at a higher value if they have entitlements on them. So just kind of a weird sequence, not weird, I don't like that word, an abnormal sequence of events Monday.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, though, Don, as you mentioned, they don't really know what they're going to do with the land.
No, and they said, it allows us to have some flexibility and I've looked at it. I'm like, what do you do with the land? Because it's separated from the campus by a road. The only thing that's on that side of the street is the track and the football facility. They actually just redid the track. And the interesting thing is these neighbors' concerns about the possibility of asbestos on a building being torn down. Again, we don't know if there's even asbestos in here, and we don't know if the demolition is harmful. Setting all that aside, the building would still have to be torn down if the school just wanted to develop the property in all likelihood. So we'll be watching this. I'm not sure what they might do there. Maybe it's more grass space for students to do stuff on, or I don't really know. But we'll be watching to see what the school district does next.
All right. Thanks for that, Don. We need to take another quick break so we stay on time. But very quickly, Ian, I wanted to say a big thank you and congratulations to you because you are leaving the Idaho Statesman, leaving our Reporter Roundtable, but you are heading back east for a new opportunity in Washington, D.C. So much congratulations and best of luck to you in your new adventures.
Thank you, Gemma. I really appreciate that. Thanks for having me on over the years. I appreciate it.
Congrats, Ian. You're one of the best.
Drew, let's head back up to Valley County. Talk to us about this proposal that would develop wildfire risk zones in that county.
Absolutely. So this is kind of we're at the beginning of a process here to essentially the fire districts in conjunction with the Valley County Fire Working Group are developing a map that will pretty much assess the risk of different areas throughout the county of wildfire. It'll be based on a number of different factors, accessibility by road, vegetation, slope, defensibility, recent wildfire history, those kinds of things. And then essentially that map, which they're hoping to have complete by this summer, so by this coming fire season, that map would be attached to code updates that would require more fire resilient building construction, whether it be materials or just type of construction, as well as landscaping. And so then, a developer or just somebody building a home would be able to come in and say, well, here's my address, and based on that, determine, okay, well, these are the standards that apply there. Now, there's a couple motivations behind this, one of which is obviously just improve safety and defensibility from wildfire. But also it's homeowners insurance. Here in Valley County in the last year or two, a lot of homeowners have been dropped from their policies, and a lot of local insurance companies are not writing new policies in Valley County, or at the very least are restricting new policies. And so, in addition to being about safety, this proposal, that's being developed is kind of about trying to retain access to homeowners insurance policies for homeowners.
Ruth, can you talk to us about a bill that's advancing in the State House right now? This would help disabled Idahoans. They'd be able to set up an account to help them save money for medical care?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking, Gemma. This is an important bill that hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet. It's called an ABLE account, which is an acronym for Achieving a Better Life Experience, and it allows people with disabilities who collect Social Security income to save money for the future for qualifying needs. So those would be things like transportation or housing or medical expenses that aren't covered by their insurance. Under current law, if they have more than $2,000 in their account, they are in jeopardy of losing their SSI. So they can't save money. Maybe you and I would save money to, for a car repair, or because we need a new washing machine, things like that. They are not able to save money. And that can be really challenging for folks with disabilities. They also have medical expenses that are not covered by maybe their Medicaid, Medicare. It's important to note these are only for people whose disability began before the age of 26. So these are folks that are chronically disabled. They're in need of government help. And so ABLE accounts would help them save money for future expenses. We are also one of only three. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to add, we are only one of 3 states in the country to not have implemented ABLE account programs. So
Ruth, where are they in this process? Because you're right. This is the first time I'm hearing about this. I think it's probably the first time a lot of folks are hearing about this. And this it sounds like a very necessary bill for these Idahoans.
Yeah, it passed the House 56-13, and it heads to the Senate. So it'll get a hearing in the Senate Health and Welfare Committee.
All right. And then after that, how then would it be passed into law once it's at that stage?
Sure. If Health and Welfare moves it forward, it'll go to the full Senate for a vote. If they move it forward, it would go to the governor. It's received, I would argue, pretty overwhelming support. So I'm hopeful that it'll pass. And I think there are a lot of folks with disabilities that really, really could benefit from this kind of account.
Well, thank you for bringing this to our attention, Ruth. I mean, honestly, it's good to see bills like this going through the process, and that could really make a difference for folks. I want to thank all of you so much for joining us. We have run out of time. I know we had a lot more to talk about, but so appreciate all of the reporting from all of these news outlets. And folks, I encourage all of you to really take time to read and to listen to all of these journalists, because they do great work for Idaho. We've been talking with Don Day, the founder and editor of BoiseDev.com, along with Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports, Troy Oppie, he is our All Things Considered host right here on Boise State Public Radio, Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for Valley Lookout, and Ian Max Stevenson with the Idaho Statesman, who, as we mentioned, is heading to a new position in D.C. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
We're more than just podcasts and a radio station at Boise State Public Radio. We're a trusted resource and a lifeline for communities across Idaho. It's up to all of us to safeguard public media's future. You can learn more at protectmypublicmedia.org. Together, we can ensure that Boise State Public Radio remains a trusted resource for you and your neighbors for generations to come.